All that coming up, but first, protesters who have been served an eviction order to leave the site of the proposed new nuclear power station in Somerset say they've no intention of moving. The group began their occupation of a barn close to Hinkley Point about a week ago. Meanwhile, people living in the shadow of the power station say they're being ignored by the planning authority, who have to decide whether the new nuclear reactors are built. Clinton Rogers reports.
The protesters insist this isn't a game to them. It's a question of protecting democracy. And they say they'll keep the campfires burning even under threat of eviction from the landowners EDF Energy.
There are certainly some of us who are prepared to fight this all the way, and they are going to have to literally carry us out of here, because until we get a chance to have democratic scrutiny of these plans and return power to the people in this country about what happens in their environment, we're prepared to keep fighting.
EDF has applied to build the first of a new breed of nuclear reactors right next to their original station at Hinkley Point. They've been given permission to start the groundwork, even though they don't have formal approval yet. That's what's angered these protesters, who say it's like digging foundations for a new house before you've got planning permission.
So much stuff.
This weekend, EDF served them legal paperwork, a lot of it, warning of action in the High Court next week to make this and any future occupations illegal and a contempt of court. They say they hope the protesters will leave of their own accord. Meanwhile, there is anger today in villages which sit in the very shadow of Hinkley Point. A new body called the Infrastructure Planning Commission will decide in the end whether Hinkley C should be built. And yet, while the parish of Stogursey will suffer the brunt of any building disruption for a decade, they've been left off a list of places where the IPC will hold public meetings.
We are the host parish that's going to take this actual massive project, if not the biggest project in Europe, on our doorstep, and we haven't even been given floor space to come and air our views.
The IPC issued a statement this afternoon saying that Stogursey wasn't being forgotten, that the list of public meetings they'd published was merely a draft one. But that's done little to appease people here who believe they're being ignored over one of the biggest decisions to affect this region for a generation. This afternoon, new protesters were making their way to the Hinkley occupation site. On many fronts, this is a battle with a long way to run yet. Clinton Rogers, BBC Points West, Somerset.
Well, as EDF pushes ahead with plans for a new nuclear reactor at Hinkley, just 50 or so miles up the coast, another of our power stations is about to be switched off completely. Oldbury opened in 1967. The two-reactor plant on the south of the River Severn has been generating power for 20 years longer than planned. But next week, it will finally stop operating. Our Gloucestershire reporter Steve Nibbs has been along to see how the shutdown has been progressing.
When Oldbury Power Station was built in the 60s, it was seen as a way of future-proofing power generation. There was also a promise of lower bills.
And the answer we all want to know, will it mean cheaper electricity?
Well, not immediately, but in the foreseeable future we expect it will.
Once Oldbury was generating, it was part of a small number of nuclear power stations, but at the official opening it was recognised that that number would soon grow.
It was a mere 10 years after the first atom bomb was dropped at Hiroshima that the first electricity was pouring out of Calder Hall into the grid in this country. And since then there's been a steady development of nuclear power. But of course we're only at the beginning of the development of nuclear power.
The nuclear reactors here have powered the turbines for over 40 years, providing huge amounts of electricity to the grid. The high-tech control room of the 1960s has hardly changed, but now Oldbury, which is the oldest operating nuclear power station in the world, is about to power down. Last year, Reactor 2 was shut off, and next week the button will be pushed to stop Reactor 1. Then the decommissioning work will begin.
There's a lot of work to do following that in terms of making the rest of the plant safe from the hazards that are stored here. For example, we have to remove all the fuel over the next few years and send that for reprocessing in Cumbria. There's a lot of gases and chemicals on site which we obviously have to make safe as well. And we'll do that with our with our teams here over the next 12 months or so. But then after that, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of clearing away the hazards in the site, demolishing buildings, and that's going to take us roughly 10 years to complete.
The future of nuclear power at Oldbury, though, isn't over. This land has been identified for a possible new nuclear power station in the future. It's a debate, as we know, that's very real at the moment. As for Oldbury Power Station itself, well, it will one day be razed to the ground, but not for at least a century. Steve Nibbs, BBC Points West, Oldbury on 7.